Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. If you're here right now, chances are you're looking for something to fill the quiet spaces. Maybe you're winding down for the night. Maybe you're working late with headphones on. Or perhaps you're just tired of the noise and need something slower, something deeper. This is your place for that. What you'll find here isn't flashy or fast. It's careful science told slowly. Real paleontology, real geology, real evolutionary biology, but delivered at a pace that lets you actually think about it. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand how our planet actually worked millions of years ago, without the hype or the speculation, then you're in the right place. Tonight, we're going back, way back, to a time when the Earth was so hot that ice didn't exist anywhere on the planet, when continents were still figuring out where they belonged, when life was conducting some of its most ambitious experiments in size, in flight, in simply existing on a world that had just finished, nearly ending itself. This is the story of the Jurassic period. And if you think you know it from movies or books, think again, because the real story is stranger, quieter, and far more magnificent than anything Hollywood ever imagined. If this kind of content helps you focus, helps you sleep, or just gives you a break from everything else, consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps more people find these stories, and it tells the algorithm that maybe, just maybe, there's still room for curiosity in this world. Now let's begin. Let's go back 201 million years to a planet that had just survived one of the worst days in the history of life itself. Picture a world without flowers, without grass, without birds singing in the morning, or bees humming through gardens that don't exist yet. Picture continents still pressed together, like pieces of a puzzle someone was getting tired of working on. Picture oceans that were warm from pole to pole, with no ice anywhere to cool them down. This was Earth at the dawn of the Jurassic period, and it was a planet in recovery. Just before our story begins, life had been through hell. The end Triassic extinction event had wiped out nearly half of all marine species and devastated ecosystems across the globe. Volcanic eruptions on a scale that's hard to imagine had pumped carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for thousands of years. The oceans had turned acidic, food webs had collapsed. But here's the thing about life. It doesn't give up. It adapts. It evolves. It finds ways to fill the empty spaces left behind by disaster. And in the aftermath of this extinction, something remarkable happened. The survivors didn't just rebuild the world, they redesigned it entirely. The Earth they inherited was unlike anything we see today. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were roughly 4 times higher than they are now. Global temperatures averaged about 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, warmer than our modern world. There were no polar ice caps, no frozen tundra, no seasonal snow anywhere on the planet. Instead, there was warmth, constant, humid, greenhouse warmth that stretched from the equator to what we now call the Arctic Circle. And in that warmth, life began to experiment with possibilities that had never existed before. The geography was alien too. Most of the world's land masses were still fused together in a supercontinent called Pangaea, though cracks were beginning to show. Deep beneath the surface, tectonic forces were building pressure. Magma was finding its way upward through weakening crustal zones. The Atlantic Ocean was just a narrow rift valley, barely worthy of the name. But change was coming. Slowly, inexorably, the continents were beginning to drift apart. And as they moved, they created new coastlines, new shallow seas, new opportunities for life to spread and diversify. The climate of the early Jurassic was remarkably stable, but it wasn't simple. Without polar ice to regulate global temperatures, weather patterns were driven primarily by ocean currents and atmospheric circulation. Massive monsoon systems brought seasonal rains to continental interiors. Shallow epicontinental seas flooded low-lying areas, creating vast wetlands and lagoons. These weren't the violent, chaotic conditions you might expect from a greenhouse world. They were more like a planetary sauna. Hot, yes, humid, absolutely, but predictable in a way that allowed life to settle into long-term evolutionary strategies. And the life that emerged from this stability was unprecedented in its ambition. In the oceans, survivors of the Triassic extinction began to diversify rapidly. New types of marine reptiles evolved to fill the roles left vacant by their extinct predecessors. Ammonites, those spiral-shelled cephalopods that would become the index fossils of the Mesozoic, began their remarkable radiation into thousands of species. But it was on land where the real revolution was taking place, because this is where dinosaurs finally got their chance to shine. Now, dinosaurs hadn't just appeared in the Jurassic. They'd been around since the Middle Triassic, but they'd been playing supporting roles in ecosystems dominated by other archosaurs. The extinction changed that. Suddenly, the ecological stage was cleared of its previous stars, and dinosaurs stepped into the spotlight. But these weren't the dinosaurs you're probably thinking of. Not yet. The early Jurassic dinosaurs were still relatively modest creatures, most no larger than modern horses or cattle. They walked on 2 legs or 4, depending on the species. They ate plants or meat or both, and they were just beginning to experiment with the body plans that would eventually produce some of the largest land animals in Earth's history. The key to understanding Jurassic dinosaurs is understanding that they weren't trying to become giants. They were simply responding to opportunities. And in a warm, stable, plant-rich world, being big had advantages. Larger animals are more efficient at processing food. They're better at regulating their body temperature. They're harder for predators to kill. And in an environment where food was abundant and temperatures were consistently warm, the metabolic costs of large size became manageable. So dinosaurs began to grow, not all at once, not in every lineage, but steadily, generation by generation. And as they grew, they began to reshape the very landscapes they lived in. The plant life of the Jurassic was unlike anything in the modern world. There were no flowering plants yet, no grasses, no deciduous trees that changed colour with the seasons. Instead, the world was dominated by gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, and ginkgos that formed vast evergreen forests. These weren't the sparse, struggling forests you might imagine in a hot world. They were lush, dense, and incredibly productive. The high atmospheric carbon dioxide levels acted like fertilizer, allowing plants to photosynthesize more efficiently than they can today. The warm, humid climate meant that growing seasons lasted year-round in most places. The result was a planet that was almost absurdly green. Forests covered most of the available land surface. River deltas were choked with vegetation. Even relatively dry upland areas supported dense stands of conifers and ferns. And this abundance of plant life supported an abundance of plant eaters, which in turn supported an abundance of predators. The Jurassic food webs were incredibly complex, with multiple layers of herbivores and carnivores all competing for resources and space. But the Jurassic wasn't just about dinosaurs. While these reptilian giants were evolving on land, other groups were making their own revolutionary breakthroughs. In the air, pterosaurs were perfecting the art of powered flight. These weren't dinosaurs, but they shared common ancestors with them. They had hollow bones, complex wing membranes, and sophisticated flight muscles that allowed them to soar over Jurassic landscapes with remarkable efficiency. In the oceans, marine reptiles were reaching their own extremes of size and specialization. Plesiosaurs, with necks longer than their bodies, cruised through warm seas. Ichthyosaurs evolved dolphin-like body shapes that allowed them to chase fast-moving prey through open water. And in the shadows of all this megafaunal drama, smaller creatures were conducting their own experiments. Early mammals were diversifying into ecological niches that wouldn't be available to them again until after the dinosaurs were gone. Some were becoming gliders, others were becoming swimmers. A few were even becoming burrowers, disappearing underground to avoid the attention of their larger neighbours. The insects were having their own renaissance, with abundant plant life to feed on, and no flowering plants to co-evolve with. Yet they were experimenting with forms and lifestyles that seem almost alien to modern eyes. Some had wingspans measured in feet rather than inches. Others developed complex social behaviours that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of modern ants and bees. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Jurassic was its duration. This wasn't a brief experiment in planetary greenhouse conditions. It lasted for nearly 60 million years, longer than the entire Cenozoic era, longer than the age of mammals, longer than most people can really comprehend. For 60 million years, the Earth maintained this hot, humid, dinosaur-dominated state. Generations upon generations of creatures lived and died in forests that never saw snow, under skies that never formed ice crystals, in oceans that never froze at the surface. It was a world of incredible stability, at least by geological standards, and that stability allowed evolution to conduct experiments on a scale that's hard to imagine. Species had time to develop elaborate adaptations, ecosystems had time to become incredibly complex, and body sizes had time to reach extremes that still seem impossible today. The sauropods, those long-necked, long-tailed giants that have become the icons of prehistoric life, represent perhaps the ultimate expression of Jurassic evolutionary experimentation. These animals grew to lengths of 30 meters or more, and weights measured in tens of tons. They were living, breathing skyscrapers, biological monuments to what's possible when evolution has enough time and the right conditions to work with. But they didn't appear overnight. The story of how dinosaurs became giants is a story of gradual change, of small adaptations accumulating over millions of years. It's a story of air-filled bones becoming lighter, of necks becoming longer, of digestive systems becoming more efficient. And it's a story that was just beginning as the Jurassic period dawned. Because what we see in the early Jurassic aren't the giants themselves, but their ancestors, the creatures that were testing out the basic body plans, the fundamental engineering solutions that would eventually allow their descendants to reach sizes that seemed to violate the laws of physics. These early experiments weren't always successful. The fossil record is full of dinosaur lineages that tried different approaches to size and lifestyle, only to go extinct when conditions changed or competitors appeared. Evolution is littered with promising ideas that didn't quite work out, but the ones that did work out changed the planet. They created ecosystems unlike anything before or since. They demonstrated that life can achieve sizes and complexities that still challenge our understanding of biology and physics, and they set the stage for one of the most remarkable periods in Earth's history. A time when the planet belonged to giants, when the air was thick with carbon dioxide and the possibilities for life seemed endless. This is where our story truly begins. Not with the giants themselves, but with the world that made giants possible. Not with the finished products of evolution, but with the experiments, the false starts, the gradual accumulation of changes that would eventually reshape life on Earth. So let's dive deeper. Let's explore this alien world of warmth and giants, of experimentation and abundance. Let's see how life responded to a planet that had just survived catastrophe and emerged into something entirely new. Because the Jurassic period wasn't just about dinosaurs becoming big. It was about life itself, learning to think bigger. The first giants didn't look like giants at all. They looked confused. Picture this. You're standing in a steamy forest 190 million years ago, and you see what looks like a large horse walking on its hind legs, occasionally dropping down to all fours when it gets tired. Its neck is longer than it should be, but not dramatically so. Its tail drags behind it like an afterthought, and every few minutes it stops, looks around as if it's lost, and continues munching on fern fronds with the mechanical determination of something that hasn't quite figured out what it's supposed to be doing. This is Volcanodon, and it represents one of evolution's most awkward moments, the point where dinosaurs were trying to solve a problem they didn't fully understand yet. The problem was simple. How do you get big without falling over? It sounds trivial, but it's not. physics has opinions about large land animals. Specifically, physics says that if you want to weigh several tons, you need to distribute that weight properly. You can't just scale up a chicken and expect it to work. The engineering changes fundamentally. Early sauropod ancestors, like Volcanodon, were conducting these engineering experiments in real time, over millions of years. Through trial and error, some lineages tried staying bipedal longer, others experimented with different neck lengths, a few tested various tail configurations. Most failed. The fossil record from this period is littered with the remains of dinosaurs that almost became giants, but didn't quite solve the mathematical problems involved. But some did. And when they did, they changed everything. By the Middle Jurassic, around 170 million years ago, something had clicked. The basic blueprint was established. Walk on 4 legs, keep your neck long but not too long, develop air-filled bones to reduce weight, and build your digestive system like a fermentation tank. This wasn't elegant. Early sauropods weren't graceful creatures gliding through prehistoric forests. They were biological construction projects, massive, ungainly, but functional experiments in what happens when you prioritize size over speed. And it worked. Within a few million years, dinosaurs had produced animals like Satiosaurus in England and Shunnosaurus in China. These weren't the 30-metre monsters that would come later, but they were respectable giants. Animals the size of modern elephants, but with necks that could reach treetops no elephant could touch. More importantly, they were successful. Their fossils appear in groups, suggesting they lived in herds. Their footprints show up in trackways that stretch for kilometres. They left bite marks on plants and scars on tree trunks from their passage. For the first time in Earth's history, truly giant herbivores were reshaping entire landscapes just by existing. But they weren't alone, because as soon as life figures out how to make giant plant eaters, it inevitably figures out how to make things that eat giant plant eaters. The predators of the Middle Jurassic were still experimenting too, but their experiments took different forms. Instead of getting bigger immediately, they got more sophisticated, more coordinated, more precise in their killing. Dilophosaurus, despite what movies might have told you, was not a small frilled creature that spat poison. It was a 7-metre-long predator with twin crests rising from its skull, like bizarre ornaments. These crests were thin, delicate, and completely useless for fighting. So what were they for? Display, status, recognition. The same reasons peacocks have elaborate tail feathers, because by this point in the Jurassic, predators weren't just hunting, they were communicating with each other. And that suggests something remarkable. They were becoming social. Not social in the human sense, obviously, but social enough to need ways to identify members of their own species, to signal their intentions, to coordinate their behaviour. The crests of Dilophosaurus were biological billboards, advertising information about age, health, and species identity to any other predator that might be watching. This was a new development in the history of life on Earth. For most of evolutionary history, predators had been solitary creatures. They hunted alone, lived alone, and died alone. But the abundance of the Jurassic, the sheer quantity of available prey, was making new behaviours possible. Some trackways from this period show multiple predators moving in the same direction, with similar spacing between their footprints. That could be coincidence, or it could be evidence of the first coordinated group hunts in vertebrate history. We'll probably never know for certain, but the possibility is there, preserved in stone, waiting for someone to interpret the evidence correctly. Meanwhile, in the oceans, an entirely different revolution was taking place. While dinosaurs were experimenting with size on land, marine reptiles were experimenting with speed and efficiency in the water. The ichthyosaurs had already perfected their dolphin-like body plan, but they were pushing it to new extremes. Some species were growing to lengths of 20 metres or more, larger than most modern whales. Others were developing enormous eyes, some nearly a foot in diameter, that allowed them to hunt in the deep ocean, where sunlight never penetrated. These weren't just big marine reptiles, They were sophisticated predators with complex social behaviours, advanced sensory systems, and hunting strategies that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of modern marine mammals. And they were fast. Biomechanical analysis of ichthyosaur skeletons suggests they could reach speeds of 40 kilometers per hour or more, fast enough to outrun most fish, fast enough to generate enough force to stun prey with their impact alone. The plesiosaurs took a different approach. Instead of speed, they opted for reach. Their necks grew longer and longer, eventually reaching proportions that seemed physically impossible. Some species had necks with over 70 vertebrae, more than twice as many as a giraffe. These extreme necks weren't just for show. They were precision hunting tools, allowing plesiosaurs to strike at fish from a distance while keeping their large bodies motionless in the water. Think of them as living submarine periscopes, equipped with jaws full of needle-sharp teeth. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Jurassic marine ecosystems was their stability. Unlike terrestrial ecosystems, which were constantly being reshaped by the activities of giant dinosaurs, marine ecosystems found a balance and maintained it for tens of millions of years. This stability allowed marine life to develop remarkable sophistication. Ammonites evolved shells with complex internal structures that allowed them to control their buoyancy with incredible precision. Some species could adjust their position in the water column to within a few centimeters, hovering motionless at specific depths while waiting for prey. Fish were undergoing their own revolution during this period. The group that includes most modern fish species, the teleosts, was just beginning to diversify. But even in their early forms, they showed innovations that would eventually make them the most successful vertebrates on Earth. Their jaws were more flexible than those of their predecessors, allowing them to create suction when feeding. Their swim bladders were more sophisticated, giving them precise control over their buoyancy. Their scales were thinner and lighter, reducing drag while swimming. These might seem like minor improvements, but in evolutionary terms, they were revolutionary. Within a few million years, these new fish types were outcompeting their more primitive relatives across the globe. And in the skies above this aquatic drama, pterosaurs were conducting their own experiments in powered flight. Early Jurassic pterosaurs like Dimorphodon still had long tails and relatively simple wing structures, but they were already showing signs of the innovations that would eventually make them masters of the Mesozoic skies. Their bones were hollow, reducing weight without sacrificing strength. Their wing membranes were complex structures reinforced with fibres that could adjust stiffness during flight. Their brains showed enlarged regions devoted to balance and spatial orientation. But most remarkably, they were diverse. Some species were specialised for soaring over open water, others were adapted for manoeuvring through dense forests. A few were developing the ability to walk and run on the ground when not flying. This diversity suggests that by the Middle Jurassic, pterosaurs had already figured out most of the basic problems of powered flight. They weren't just gliding or soaring, they were actively flying, with all the metabolic and biomechanical challenges that implies. And they were doing it with a completely different wing design than birds would eventually develop. Pterosaur wings were supported primarily by an enormously elongated fourth finger, with the wing membrane stretching from this finger to the body and hind limbs. This created a wing that was incredibly efficient for soaring, but could also be folded completely when not in use. Unlike birds, pterosaurs could walk normally on the ground without their wings getting in the way. But perhaps the most impressive thing about Middle Jurassic ecosystems was how all these different experiments in size, speed and lifestyle fit together. The giant sauropods weren't just wandering around eating everything in sight. They were part of complex ecological networks that included dozens of other dinosaur species, marine reptiles, pterosaurs, early mammals, and countless invertebrates. These weren't simple predator-prey relationships. They were intricate webs of competition, cooperation, and mutual dependence that took millions of years to develop and fine-tune. And they were stable, not static. Species continued to evolve and change, but stable in the sense that the basic structure of these ecosystems persisted for tens of millions of years. That kind of ecological stability is almost unknown in the modern world. Most of our current ecosystems are relatively young, having been shaped by ice ages, continental drift, and human activity within the last few million years. But Jurassic ecosystems had time to mature, to develop complexity that we can barely imagine. And that complexity created opportunities for evolutionary experiments that simply aren't possible in less stable environments. The giants of the late Jurassic, the truly enormous sauropods that capture our imagination today, were only possible because of this stability. They required ecosystems that could support their massive appetites, food webs that could channel enough energy to fuel their growth, and environments that remained consistent enough for their slow life cycles to function properly. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the true giants emerged, before the classic Jurassic fauna that everyone recognises, there was this middle period, this time of experimentation and testing, of evolutionary trial and error on a scale that the planet had never seen before. It wasn't as dramatic as what came later, it wasn't as iconic, but it was essential, because without these middle Jurassic experiments, without these awkward, ungainly proto-giants stumbling through prehistoric forests, the age of true giants never would have arrived. The foundation was being laid, one evolutionary innovation at a time, and the results would reshape life on Earth in ways that are still visible today, 170 million years later. The late Jurassic was when Earth finally figured out how to build monsters properly. By 155 million years ago, the experimental phase was over. The awkward proto-giants had worked out their engineering problems, and what emerged from their evolutionary tinkering were creatures so large they seemed to mock our understanding of biology itself. This is when we get Diplodocus. 30 metres, from nose to tail tip, a neck longer than a school bus, a tail that could crack like a whip and generate sonic booms. An animal so impossibly long that its brain couldn't communicate with its tail in real time. Nerve signals literally took too long to travel the distance, and yet somehow it worked. The Morrison Formation of Western North America preserves this world for us in extraordinary detail. River channels and floodplains that once supported the largest land animals in Earth's history. Mudstone layers that captured their footprints as they passed. Bone beds where their skeletons accumulated after seasonal floods. What we see in these rocks isn't just individual giant animals. It's entire ecosystems organised around gigantism. Multiple species of sauropods, each specialised for feeding at different heights. Stegosaurs with their bizarre backplates wandering through fern prairies. Predators that had evolved specifically to hunt prey larger than modern elephants. But here's what's really remarkable about these late Jurassic giants. They weren't struggling to exist, they were thriving. Diplodocus fossils show up in groups. Their trackways suggest they moved in herds. Some bone beds contain juveniles and adults together, implying complex social structures. These weren't lonely monsters stumbling through empty landscapes, they were members of functioning communities, and the communities were vast. Computer models suggest that a single adult Diplodocus needed to consume roughly 400 kilograms of plant matter every day. Multiply that by herd sizes of dozens or hundreds of individuals, and you're talking about biological strip mining on an industrial scale. Yet the forests kept growing, the ferns kept spreading, the conifers reached heights that wouldn't be seen again until flowering plants evolved tens of millions of years later. How was this possible? How could ecosystems support such massive appetites without collapsing? The answer lies partly in the climate, but mostly in time. The late Jurassic greenhouse was running at full capacity. Carbon dioxide levels were still 3 to 4 times higher than today. Global temperatures were warm enough to support lush vegetation, even at the poles. There was no seasonal dieback, no winter dormancy, no months when plants stopped growing. This created a biological productivity that's almost impossible to imagine. Forests that grew year-round, rivers that never froze, wetlands that supported plant growth at rates that would seem impossible in our modern world. But productivity alone doesn't explain the giants. Plenty of ecosystems in Earth's history have been highly productive without producing 50-ton herbivores. What made the late Jurassic special was stability. These ecosystems had been developing for 40 million years by this point. They'd had time to work out the complex relationships between predators and prey, between herbivores and plants, between different species competing for the same resources. That stability allowed for evolutionary strategies that simply wouldn't work in less predictable environments. Giant sauropods could afford to grow slowly and live for decades or centuries because their food sources were reliable. Predators could afford to specialize in hunting specific types of prey because those prey species weren't going extinct every few million years, and the giants weren't just sauropods. Allosaurus was pushing the boundaries of what's possible for a terrestrial predator. 12 meters long, weighing as much as 2 elephants, with a skull designed like a hatchet for delivering devastating slashing attacks. Its arms were powerful enough to grapple with prey, its legs built for sustained pursuit over long distances. But Allosaurus wasn't just big, it was smart, at least smart for a dinosaur. Its brain was proportionally larger than those of earlier predators. Its sensory systems were more sophisticated. There's evidence it could track prey over considerable distances, possibly even coordinate with other individuals during hunts. The herbivores were responding to this predation pressure in fascinating ways. Stegosaurus developed its iconic backplates and tail spikes, not just for defense, but possibly for thermoregulation and species recognition. Camarasaurus evolved stronger teeth and jaws, allowing it to process tougher plant material that other herbivores couldn't handle, and some herbivores were getting armor. The first ankylosaurs were appearing during this period, covered in bony plates and spikes that made them nearly invulnerable to predator attacks. They represent a completely different approach to the size arms race. Instead of getting bigger, they were getting harder to kill. In the skies above this terrestrial drama, pterosaurs were reaching their own extremes. Pterodactylus had abandoned the long tail of earlier species in favour of more efficient flight. Its wings could span 3 meters, allowing it to soar over vast distances with minimal energy expenditure. But the real aerial innovations were happening in smaller species. Anurognathus was developing the agility and maneuverability that would eventually make pterosaurs masters of powered flight. Its broad mouth and large eyes suggest it was catching insects on the wing, behaviour that requires split-second timing and incredible aerial precision. The oceans were experiencing their own age of giants. Leadsichthys was pushing the boundaries of what's possible for a bony fish. Some estimates put it at over 15 meters in length. Unlike modern filter-feeding whales, it was still technically a fish, with gills and scales, and a skeleton made of bone rather than cartilage. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Leadsichthys was that it existed at all. Filter-feeding giants require incredibly productive marine ecosystems to support their massive food requirements. The fact that the Jurassic oceans could support such creatures tells us something profound about the biological productivity of this period. Marine reptiles were diversifying into forms that wouldn't be seen again until the age of whales. Some ichthyosaurs were developing echolocation, biological sonar that allowed them to hunt in murky water or at depths where vision was useless. Plesiosaurs were experimenting with neck lengths that pushed the boundaries of structural engineering. And ammonites, those spiral-shelled cephalopods that would become the index fossils of the Mesozoic, were reaching peaks of diversity and abundance that still astound paleontologists. Some species could hover motionless in the water column, adjusting their buoyancy with microscopic precision. Others could jet through the water at high speeds, pursuing prey or fleeing from predators. The success of these marine ecosystems was built on the same foundation as terrestrial ecosystems: stability and productivity. Warm, nutrient-rich oceans that supported complex food webs. Climatic conditions that remained consistent for millions of years at a time. But there was something else happening during the late Jurassic that would prove even more significant in the long run. In the undergrowth of these giant-dominated ecosystems, smaller creatures were conducting experiments that would eventually reshape the entire planet. Early mammals were diversifying into ecological niches that wouldn't become available to them again until after the dinosaurs were extinct. Some were becoming gliders, developing wing membranes that allowed them to move between trees without touching the ground. Others were becoming swimmers, with webbed feet and flattened tails that made them perfectly adapted for aquatic life. These weren't evolutionary dead ends, they were beta tests for body plans and lifestyles that would eventually produce bats, whales, and dozens of other mammalian groups. The Jurassic mammals weren't waiting for their turn, they were preparing for it. Similarly, the first birds were appearing during this period. Not quite birds as we know them today, but definitely not dinosaurs either. Archaeopteryx had feathers and could fly, but it also had teeth and claws, and a long bony tail. It represents a moment of evolutionary transition that's preserved in stone, a creature caught halfway between two different ways of being alive. And in the plant world, the first flowering plants were beginning to experiment with new reproductive strategies. Not the complex, colourful flowers we know today, but simple structures that hinted at the revolution to come. Within a few million years, these early angiosperms would transform terrestrial ecosystems as thoroughly as the dinosaurs had. But for now, in the late Jurassic, the world still belonged to giants, to creatures so large they seemed to violate natural laws, to ecosystems so complex and stable that they supported biological experiments on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until humans started reshaping the planet. The late Jurassic represents perhaps the ultimate expression of what's possible when evolution has enough time and the right conditions to work with. It wasn't just about individual species becoming large. It was about entire ecosystems scaling up to accommodate sizes and lifestyles that push the boundaries of physics and biology, and it lasted. These giant-dominated ecosystems persisted for tens of millions of years, through climate fluctuations and sea level changes, and all the usual disruptions that normally reset evolutionary experiments. That kind of stability is almost impossible to imagine in our modern world, where ecosystems can be completely transformed within decades. But the Jurassic had a different relationship with time. Changes happened slowly, gradually, allowing life to adapt and adjust, rather than simply go extinct. The result was a world that seems almost impossibly rich and complex to modern eyes. A world where 50-ton herbivores could coexist with house cat-sized mammals, where flying reptiles shared the skies with the first birds, where marine ecosystems could support filter-feeding fish larger than modern whales. It was the age of giants in the truest sense, not just giant animals, but giant possibilities, giant experiments, giant successes that wouldn't be repeated until entirely different groups of organisms inherited the Earth. And yet, like all ages, it was temporary. The conditions that made such gigantism possible were already beginning to change. Sea levels were fluctuating. Continental positions were shifting. New types of plants and animals were evolving that would eventually challenge the dominance of the Jurassic giants. But that's a story for later. For now, in this moment, 150 million years ago, the Earth belonged to creatures that still seem impossible, and they were thriving in ways that remind us just how strange and wonderful life can become when it has enough time to dream big. The giants weren't just surviving, they were succeeding, and their success would echo through the rest of Earth's history, even after they were gone. But success, in evolutionary terms, is always temporary, and by the very end of the Jurassic, something subtle was beginning to shift. Not catastrophically. There was no asteroid, no volcanic apocalypse, no sudden mass die-off. Instead, the changes were gradual, almost imperceptible, like the slow turning of seasons across geological time. The first hints came from the plants. Deep in the understory of those towering conifer forests, small weedy species were experimenting with something entirely new. Not the naked seeds of gymnosperms that had dominated for 200 million years, but enclosed seeds, protected seeds, seeds wrapped in structures that would eventually become fruits. These weren't flowers yet, not as we'd recognise them. They were simple, unremarkable reproductive organs on plants that looked almost identical to their gymnosperm cousins. But they represented the earliest whispers of what would become the angiosperm revolution, a transformation that would reshape terrestrial ecosystems more thoroughly than anything since the first forests emerged from the seas. The early angiosperms were pioneers in the truest sense. They thrived in disturbed habitats, riverbanks scoured by seasonal floods, forest clearings created by falling giant trees, volcanic slopes where ash had sterilized the soil, places where the established gymnosperm communities couldn't immediately re-establish themselves. This gave them an advantage that would prove crucial in the coming era. While gymnosperms were adapted for stability, for long-term persistence in unchanging environments, angiosperms were adapted for change, for rapid colonization of new habitats, for evolutionary flexibility, and change was coming, whether the Jurassic giants were ready for it or not. Continental drift was accelerating. The Atlantic Ocean was widening from a narrow rift into a genuine seaway. Gondwana was beginning to fracture along what would become the boundaries between South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. New mountain ranges were rising as tectonic plates collided and overrode each other. These geological changes created new climate patterns. Regional weather systems that had been stable for tens of millions of years began to shift. Monsoon patterns changed direction. Ocean currents found new pathways. Even the composition of the atmosphere began to fluctuate as volcanic activity waxed and waned across the globe. The changes weren't dramatic by human standards. Average temperatures might have varied by only a few degrees over millions of years. Sea levels rose and fell within ranges that wouldn't have been immediately obvious to any individual creature. But for ecosystems that had evolved under conditions of extreme stability, even small changes created stress. And that stress began to show up in the fossil record. Sauropod diversity, which had exploded during the Middle and Late Jurassic, began to plateau. New species were still evolving, but at slower rates. Some lineages that had been successful for millions of years started to show signs of decline. Footprint evidence suggests that herd sizes may have been shrinking in some regions. The predators were changing too. The large generalized hunters like Allosaurus were being joined and sometimes replaced by more specialized forms. Some developed longer legs for chasing faster prey. Others evolved more powerful jaws for crushing bones. A few began to experiment with the body plans that would eventually produce the tyrannosaurids. These changes weren't failures of the Jurassic system. They were adaptations to new pressures, new opportunities, new challenges, but they marked the beginning of a transition that would fundamentally alter the character of life on Earth. In the oceans, similar patterns were emerging. Marine reptile diversity was beginning to plateau after tens of millions of years of steady increase. Some ichthyosaur lineages were going extinct, though others continued to thrive. Plesiosaurs were experimenting with new body plans, but the era of simple, steady diversification was ending. And in the plankton, those microscopic organisms that form the base of marine food webs, new types were beginning to appear. Calcareous nanoplankton, tiny organisms with calcium carbonate shells, were becoming more abundant. These organisms would eventually become so common that their shells would form the chalk deposits that gave the next geological period its name. Even the ammonites, those incredibly successful spiral-shelled cephalopods, were showing signs of change. Their shell shapes were becoming more varied, more experimental. Some species were developing shells so complex they seem almost baroque in their ornamentation. This kind of morphological experimentation often signals evolutionary stress, populations trying new strategies as old ones become less reliable. But perhaps the most significant changes were happening in groups that had been marginal during the Jurassic heyday. Small theropod dinosaurs were developing increasingly bird-like characteristics. Not just feathers, many dinosaurs had those by now, but flight-related adaptations in their skeletons, their muscles, their metabolisms. Early mammals were becoming more diverse and more sophisticated. Some were developing more complex teeth that allowed them to process a wider variety of foods. Others were experimenting with different reproductive strategies, different social behaviours, different ways of raising their young. These changes were subtle, easily overlooked in the shadow of the continuing giant sauropods and massive predators, but they represented the future. The groups that would eventually inherit the Earth were already adapting to conditions that hadn't fully emerged yet, and those conditions were becoming more variable, more unpredictable, less amenable to the kind of stable, long-term evolutionary strategies that had made Jurassic gigantism possible. The greenhouse climate that had persisted for nearly 60 million years was beginning to show cracks. Not a collapse. The world was still warm, still humid, still largely ice-free. But the rock-solid stability that had allowed ecosystems to mature over tens of millions of years was starting to give way to something more dynamic, more changeable. Seasonal variations were becoming more pronounced in some regions. Dry seasons were lasting longer, wet seasons were becoming more intense. The reliable, predictable climate patterns that had supported such massive herbivores were slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming less reliable. For creatures that lived for decades or centuries, that reproduced slowly, that required enormous amounts of food every day, even small increases in environmental variability could be problematic. Giant sauropods couldn't quickly adapt to changing food sources. They couldn't migrate rapidly to new areas. They couldn't adjust their metabolisms to cope with seasonal scarcity. Smaller, more flexible organisms had advantages in this changing world. They could reproduce more quickly, allowing their populations to adapt genetically to new conditions within a few generations. They could change their diets more easily. They could move to new habitats without the massive logistical challenges faced by 50-ton herbivores. This didn't mean the giants were doomed. Many sauropod lineages would continue to thrive well into the Cretaceous. But it meant their era of unchallenged dominance was ending. The age of giants was giving way to an age of adaptation, flexibility, and rapid evolutionary change. The transition was so gradual that no individual creature would have noticed it. A diplodocus living at the very end of the Jurassic would have experienced essentially the same world as its ancestors had millions of years earlier. The forests were still lush, the climate still warm, the food still abundant. But the trends were there, written in stone for paleontologists to discover 150 million years later. Diversity curves that had been climbing steadily began to level off. Evolutionary rates that had been relatively slow began to accelerate. Ecological relationships that had been stable for geological ages began to shift. The Jurassic wasn't ending with a bang. It was ending with a whisper. A gradual transition so subtle that it would take modern science decades to recognise it in the fossil record. But it was real, and it was irreversible. The world was changing again. Not as dramatically as it had during the Great Extinction that ended the Triassic. Not as suddenly as it would when an asteroid struck at the end of the Cretaceous. But changing nonetheless in ways that would reshape life on Earth just as thoroughly as any catastrophe. The age of giants was drawing to a close, not through failure, but through success so complete that it had transformed the very conditions that made it possible. The Jurassic giants had eaten their world into something new, something that would require different strategies, different adaptations, different ways of being alive, and life, as always, was ready for the challenge. In the shadows of the giants, new experiments were already underway. New possibilities were being tested. New futures were being written in the genes of small, seemingly insignificant creatures that would someday inherit a very different Earth. The Jurassic had been Earth's experiment in gigantism, in stability, in what's possible when evolution has enough time and the right conditions to push biological systems to their absolute limits. It had succeeded beyond anything seen before or since. But like all successful experiments, it had taught life something new about itself, and that knowledge would shape everything that came next. The giants had shown what was possible. Now it was time for the rest of life to show what was practical in a world that was learning to change again. The question isn't whether the Jurassic ended. The question is whether anyone noticed when it did. Because unlike the dramatic extinctions that bookend most geological periods, the volcanic catastrophes, the asteroid impacts, the sudden disappearances, the end of the Jurassic was something else entirely. It was a transition so subtle, so gradual, that life barely seemed to pause between one era and the next. But pause it did. And when paleontologists look closely at the boundary between the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, around 145 million years ago, they find something fascinating. Not the absence of life, but its quiet transformation. Species didn't vanish overnight. Instead, they began to change, to adapt, to prepare for a world that was slowly becoming something new. The first signs weren't dramatic. In the shallow seas that covered much of Europe, tiny organisms called coccolithophores began to multiply. These microscopic algae had been around for millions of years, but something in the changing ocean chemistry favoured their growth. Their calcium carbonate shells began accumulating on seafloors in unprecedented quantities. This might seem like a minor detail, the success of organisms so small you'd need a microscope to see them individually. But those tiny shells would eventually form the chalk deposits that gave the next period its name. The white cliffs of Dover, the chalky soils of the Great Plains, limestone formations across the globe, all built from the remains of creatures that thrived as the Jurassic world transformed around them. On land, changes were equally subtle, but perhaps more significant. The first true flowering plants were beginning to appear, though you might not have recognised them as flowers. These early angiosperms looked more like weeds than the colourful blooms we associate with flowering plants today. They were small, unremarkable, and easily overlooked among the towering conifers and cycads that still dominated most landscapes. But they had something their gymnosperm competitors lacked: speed. While conifers took decades to mature and reproduce, these early flowering plants could complete their life cycles in a single growing season. They could colonize disturbed ground quickly, evolve rapidly in response to changing conditions, and spread to new habitats faster than established plant communities could exclude them. This gave them a crucial advantage in a world where stability was beginning to give way to change. And change was coming, driven by forces that had been building beneath the surface for millions of years. The supercontinent of Pangaea, which had dominated global geography for over 100 million years, was finally breaking apart in earnest. The Atlantic Ocean was widening from a narrow rift into a genuine seaway. South America was beginning to separate from Africa. India was starting its long journey northward toward Asia. These continental movements created new mountain ranges, new ocean currents, new climate patterns. Regional weather systems that had remained stable throughout the Jurassic began to shift. Monsoon patterns changed direction. Temperature gradients between equator and poles became more pronounced. Even the composition of the atmosphere began to fluctuate as new volcanic provinces became active and old ones fell dormant. For ecosystems that had evolved under conditions of extreme stability, these changes created stress. Not immediate, catastrophic stress, the kind that shows up as mass extinctions in the fossil record, but chronic, persistent stress that gradually favoured different survival strategies, different body plans, different ways of making a living. The giants that had dominated Jurassic landscapes weren't immediately threatened. Sauropods continued to thrive in many regions. Some would persist well into the Cretaceous, evolving new forms and colonising new continents as they became available. But their era of unchallenged dominance was ending. Smaller herbivores were becoming more diverse and more abundant. Ornithopods, the group that includes dinosaurs like Iguanodon and eventually the hadrosaurs, were developing more efficient teeth for processing tough plant material. Some were experimenting with elaborate crests and social behaviours that suggest increasingly complex herd dynamics. The predators were changing too. The large, generalised hunters of the Jurassic were giving way to more specialised forms. Some theropods were developing longer legs and lighter builds for pursuit hunting. Others were evolving more powerful jaws and stronger necks for tackling heavily armoured prey. A few lineages were experimenting with the body plans that would eventually produce the tyrannosaurids, but perhaps the most significant changes were happening in groups that had been marginal throughout the Jurassic. Small theropod dinosaurs were becoming increasingly bird-like, not just in their feathers, but in their flight-related skeletal adaptations. Early mammals were diversifying beyond the small generalised forms that had characterised the group for over 100 million years. These changes weren't random. They reflected new selective pressures, new opportunities, new challenges created by a world in transition. As the stable greenhouse conditions of the Jurassic gave way to more variable climate patterns, life was adapting accordingly. In the oceans, similar transitions were underway. Marine reptile faunas that had remained relatively stable for tens of millions of years were beginning to turn over. Some ichthyosaur lineages went extinct, though others continued to thrive. Plesiosaurs were experimenting with new body plans, some becoming more whale-like, others developing even more extreme neck lengths. New types of marine organisms were appearing too, rudest bivalves, clam-like creatures that built reef structures began to compete with traditional corals in shallow tropical seas. These weren't necessarily better than the organisms they replaced, but they were better adapted to the changing chemical conditions of late Jurassic and early Cretaceous oceans. Even the ammonites, those incredibly successful cephalopods that had diversified steadily throughout the Jurassic, were showing signs of change. Their shell shapes became more varied and experimental. Some developed elaborate ornamental features that seem almost baroque in their complexity. This kind of morphological experimentation often signals evolutionary pressure. Populations trying new strategies as old ones become less reliable. The transition wasn't uniform across the globe. Different regions experienced different rates and types of change. Some areas maintained relatively stable Jurassic-type ecosystems well into the Cretaceous. Others were transformed more rapidly as new species colonised and established themselves. This patchwork pattern of change is typical of gradual evolutionary transitions. Unlike mass extinctions, which affects the entire planet simultaneously, periods of evolutionary turnover often proceed at different rates in different places, creating a complex mosaic of old and new forms coexisting across the landscape. But the overall trend was clear. The biological world that emerged from this transition, the early Cretaceous world, was fundamentally different from what had come before, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of countless small changes accumulating over millions of years. The sauropods were still there, but they were no longer the unchallenged dominance of terrestrial ecosystems. Flowering plants were still rare, but they were spreading rapidly through disturbed habitats. Birds were still primitive, but they were beginning to diversify into new ecological roles. Most importantly, the pace of evolutionary change itself had accelerated. The rock-solid stability that had characterized much of the Jurassic was giving way to something more dynamic, more unpredictable. Ecosystems that had persisted largely unchanged for tens of millions of years were being reshaped within just a few million years. This acceleration would characterize the rest of the Mesozoic era and beyond. The Cretaceous would see evolutionary innovations at a pace not witnessed since the Cambrian explosion. Flowering plants would transform terrestrial ecosystems. New types of marine organisms would reshape oceanic food webs. Dinosaurs would diversify into forms more varied and spectacular than anything the Jurassic had produced. But all of this was built on the foundation laid during the Jurassic transition. The experimental body plans, the adaptive strategies, the ecological relationships that would dominate the Cretaceous were already being tested in small populations, marginal habitats, and evolutionary lineages that seemed insignificant compared to the giants that still ruled the landscape. The end of the Jurassic, then, wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning, the start of a new phase in the history of life on Earth. A phase characterized not by the stable dominance of a few highly successful groups, but by rapid change, constant innovation, and evolutionary experimentation on an unprecedented scale. The age of giants was giving way to an age of diversity. The age of stability was becoming an age of adaptation. And life, as it always does, was rising to meet the challenge. Looking back from our perspective 145 million years later, we can see this transition clearly in the fossil record. We can trace the lineages that went extinct, track the ones that survived, and follow the new groups that emerged to fill vacant ecological roles. But for the organisms living through this transition, the changes would have been almost imperceptible. A slightly different mix of plant species in the forest. New types of predators appearing occasionally. Familiar species becoming less common, while unfamiliar ones became more abundant. The Jurassic giants didn't know they were becoming extinct. The early flowering plants didn't know they were inheriting the Earth. The small theropods developing flight didn't know they were becoming birds. They were simply living, reproducing, adapting to whatever conditions they encountered. The grand patterns, the evolutionary trends, the transformation of entire ecosystems. These emerge only when we step back and look at millions of years of accumulated change. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing about the end of the Jurassic. It demonstrates that the most profound transformations in the history of life don't always require catastrophes. Sometimes they require only time and the relentless creativity of evolution, working through countless generations of organisms, simply trying to survive and reproduce in a slowly changing world. The Jurassic had been Earth's experiment in pushing biological systems to their absolute limits. It had succeeded spectacularly, producing ecosystems of unprecedented complexity and organisms of unmatched size. But success, in evolutionary terms, is always temporary. The world the Jurassic giants had created was already becoming the world that would replace them. The stable greenhouse conditions that had made their gigantism possible were giving way to more variable patterns that favoured flexibility over size, adaptation over specialisation, innovation over persistence. The age of giants was ending not with collapse but with transformation. And from that transformation would emerge the most diverse, most dynamic, most rapidly evolving biological communities in Earth's history. The Jurassic period had asked the question, how big can life become? The Cretaceous period would ask a different question entirely. How creative can life become? And the answer, as we'll discover, would reshape the planet in ways that are still unfolding today. But if you think the story ends with continental drift and flowering plants, you're missing the most extraordinary part. Because while the Earth was busy rearranging its geography and experimenting with new types of vegetation, something else was happening in the oceans, something that would make the terrestrial giants look almost modest by comparison. The Jurassic seas were about to produce their own monsters, and these weren't just big marine reptiles. These were creatures that pushed the boundaries of what vertebrate life could achieve in an aquatic environment. Animals so perfectly adapted to their watery world that they would make modern whales seem like evolutionary newcomers. The ichthyosaurs had been around since the early Mesozoic, but by the Middle Jurassic, they were reaching forms that still seem impossible today. Picture a reptile the size of a sperm whale, but built like a dolphin, with flippers instead of legs, and a tail fin that could propel it through the water at speeds approaching 40 kilometers per hour. But speed wasn't their only innovation. Some ichthyosaurs developed eyes that were literally the size of dinner plates, the largest eyes ever discovered in a vertebrate. These weren't just for show. They were precision instruments for hunting in the deep ocean, where even the faintest traces of bioluminescence could reveal the presence of prey. Ophthalmosaurus, one of the most successful ichthyosaur genera, had eyes that measured over 20 centimeters in diameter. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the eyes of any whale alive today, despite whales being significantly bigger animals. These enormous organs could gather light with an efficiency that approaches the theoretical limits of what's possible for a biological system. And they needed that efficiency because ichthyosaurs were diving deeper than any air-breathing vertebrate had ever gone before. Bone density analysis suggests some species could reach depths of 500 meters or more, holding their breath for periods that would challenge modern marine mammals. But the ichthyosaurs weren't the only marine giants of the Jurassic. In the same oceans swam creatures even stranger, the plesiosaurs, with their impossibly long necks and paddle-like limbs. These animals represent one of evolution's most audacious experiments in vertebrate body design. Some species, like Cryptoclydus, had necks containing over 70 vertebrae, more than twice as many as a giraffe. But unlike a giraffe's neck, which needs to support the head against gravity, plesiosaur necks were neutrally buoyant in water. This allowed them to reach lengths that would be structurally impossible on land. The longest plesiosaur necks stretched over 7 meters. Imagine a snake with the diameter of a telephone pole, but flexible enough to strike in any direction within a sphere larger than most modern swimming pools. And they used these necks as precision hunting instruments. While their massive bodies remained motionless in the water column, their heads could dart out to snatch fish, squid, and smaller marine reptiles with lightning speed. They were living submarine periscopes, equipped with jaws full of needle-sharp teeth. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these marine giants was their sophistication. These weren't primitive reptiles that happened to be big. They were highly evolved predators with complex behaviors and advanced sensory systems. Some ichthyosaurs show evidence of deep diving adaptations that wouldn't be matched by mammals for another 100 million years. Their rib cages were reinforced to resist crushing pressure. Their blood chemistry was modified to store more oxygen. Some may have even developed a form of echolocation for navigating in the perpetual darkness of the deep ocean. The plesiosaurs developed their own innovations. Some species show evidence of sophisticated thermoregulation, the ability to maintain their body temperature above that of the surrounding water, even in the cold depths where they hunted. This would have given them a crucial metabolic advantage over their cold-blooded prey, and both groups were remarkably successful. Ichthyosaur and plesiosaur fossils are found in marine deposits across the globe, from the Arctic to the tropics. They dominated oceanic ecosystems for over 150 million years, a tenure that dwarfs the current age of whales. Their success was built on the same foundation that supported the terrestrial giants, the incredible productivity and stability of Jurassic ecosystems. The warm, shallow seas that covered much of the continental margins were perfect nurseries for marine life. Plankton bloomed in enormous quantities. Fish diversified into thousands of species. The entire oceanic food web was supercharged with energy. But the marine giants weren't just passive beneficiaries of this productivity, they were active participants in shaping it. Their predation pressure drove the evolution of faster, smarter, more evasive prey species. Their migrations helped distribute nutrients across ocean basins. Their sheer biomass represented a significant component of marine carbon cycling. In some ways, the Jurassic oceans were even more alien than the terrestrial environments. On land, you could at least recognize the basic ecological relationships: herbivores eating plants, carnivores eating herbivores, scavengers cleaning up the remains. But in the seas, the relationships were more complex. Some marine reptiles were pursuit predators, chasing down fast-moving fish in open water. Others were ambush specialists, lying motionless until prey came within striking distance. A few were filter feeders, like the enormous bony fish leadsichthys, which could reach lengths of 15 metres, while feeding on plankton and small fish. And unlike terrestrial ecosystems, where the largest animals were herbivores, marine ecosystems could support carnivores at the very top of the size spectrum. This is still true today. The largest animals in modern oceans are whales, most of which are carnivorous, at least technically. This difference reflects the fundamental physics of life in water versus life on land. In water, buoyancy supports body weight, allowing animals to reach sizes that would be impossible for terrestrial creatures. The largest animal that ever lived, the blue whale, is alive today, swimming in our modern oceans. But the Jurassic marine giants had one advantage that modern whales lack: time, lots and lots of time. The warm, stable conditions that characterized most of the Jurassic allowed marine ecosystems to develop complexity that's hard to imagine today. Modern marine ecosystems are relatively young, having been shaped by ice ages, tectonic changes, and other disruptions within the last few million years. But Jurassic marine ecosystems had tens of millions of years to mature, to develop intricate relationships between predators and prey, to fine-tune the energy flows that supported such massive animals. The result was a biological productivity that sustained not just individual giant creatures, but entire communities of them. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, marine crocodiles, giant fish, enormous ammonites, all coexisting in the same oceanic environments, all finding ways to partition resources and avoid direct competition. And these weren't static communities. They were constantly evolving, constantly experimenting with new forms and new strategies. The diversity of marine reptile body plans during the Jurassic is staggering. Everything from eel-like forms with hundreds of vertebrae to compact turtle-like creatures with massive heads designed for crushing shells. Some marine reptiles developed armor plating that would have made them nearly invulnerable to attack. Others evolved camouflage systems that allowed them to blend perfectly with their surroundings. A few experimented with bioluminescence, the ability to produce their own light for communication or hunting. But perhaps the most remarkable innovation was social behaviour. There's growing evidence that some Jurassic marine reptiles lived and hunted in groups. Bone beds containing multiple individuals of the same species suggest pod-like behaviours similar to those of modern dolphins and whales. This social behaviour would have made them even more formidable predators. Coordinated hunting by intelligent marine reptiles could have overwhelmed prey that might have escaped individual attackers. It also would have allowed for more sophisticated parental care, with multiple adults protecting and teaching juveniles. The implications of this are profound. If Jurassic marine reptiles had complex social behaviours, it suggests they also had complex nervous systems. Brains capable of processing social information, making group decisions, perhaps even something approaching culture. We'll probably never know for certain how intelligent these creatures were. Soft tissues like brains don't fossilise well, and behaviour leaves only indirect traces in the fossil record. But the evidence we do have, the sophisticated hunting strategies, the complex social structures, the advanced sensory systems, suggests that these weren't simple-minded monsters. They were intelligent predators, as cognitively complex as many modern marine mammals. And they ruled the Jurassic oceans with a combination of size, speed, and sophistication that wouldn't be matched until the rise of whales tens of millions of years later. But like their terrestrial counterparts, the marine giants of the Jurassic were living on borrowed time. The stable conditions that supported their enormous sizes and complex ecosystems were beginning to change. Ocean chemistry was shifting. Sea levels were fluctuating. New types of prey organisms were evolving that required different hunting strategies. The transition wasn't immediate or catastrophic. Many lineages of marine reptiles would continue to thrive well into the Cretaceous. Some would even reach larger sizes than their Jurassic ancestors. But the golden age of marine reptile dominance was slowly coming to an end. In its place would emerge new types of marine ecosystems, dominated by different groups of organisms with different strategies for survival. The age of marine reptile giants would give way to an age of marine diversity, complexity, and eventually the rise of entirely new types of ocean predators. But for now, in the late Jurassic, the seas belong to creatures that still seem mythical to modern eyes. Animals so perfectly adapted to their aquatic environment that they make our modern marine life seem almost primitive by comparison. They were the true monsters of the Jurassic world. Not because they were terrible or destructive, but because they represented life pushed to its absolute limits in an environment that most terrestrial creatures couldn't even survive in. And they remind us that the story of life isn't just about what happens on land. Some of the most remarkable experiments in vertebrate evolution have taken place in the oceans, where the constraints are different, the possibilities are broader, and the results are often more spectacular than anything achieved on dry ground. The Jurassic oceans were Earth's laboratory for testing the limits of what's possible for large, intelligent, air-breathing animals living in a completely aquatic environment. And the results of those tests still echo through our modern seas, in the whales and dolphins that inherited the ecological roles once filled by ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. But that inheritance came at a cost, because when the marine reptile giants finally did disappear, they took with them body plans and adaptive strategies that have never been repeated. The oceans today, for all their diversity and productivity, are missing something that was once there, a type of vertebrate life that was perfectly, uniquely adapted to the marine environment in ways that modern whales, despite their success, have never quite achieved. The Jurassic marine giants were one of evolution's greatest successes, and like all great successes, they were also unrepeatable, unique moments in the history of life that can never come again. They were the last giants of their world, and they didn't know it. Picture yourself standing in what we now call Europe, 145 million years ago. The ground trembles beneath your feet, not from earthquakes, but from footsteps. Massive, deliberate, unhurried footsteps that speak of creatures so large they've forgotten what it means to be afraid. This is the very end of the Jurassic period, and you're witnessing the final act of Earth's most successful experiment in biological gigantism. But the performers don't know the curtain is about to fall. The sauropods of the late Jurassic weren't just big, they were architecturally impossible. Brontosaurus, despite what you might have heard about its name being invalid, was very real and very much a testament to evolution's willingness to break its own rules. 30 meters of vertebrae and muscle somehow organized into a functional animal. But here's what makes these final Jurassic giants truly remarkable. They weren't struggling. They weren't evolutionary dead ends, limping toward extinction. They were thriving in ways that still challenge our understanding of how large land animals can actually live. Take Giraffatitan, found in what's now Tanzania. This animal stood as tall as a 4-story building and weighed as much as 12 elephants. Its heart had to pump blood up a neck that stretched 12 meters into the canopy. The engineering challenges alone should have made it impossible. Yet Giraffatitan fossils show up in groups. Their trackways suggest they move together across seasonal migration routes. Some bone beds contain individuals of different ages, implying complex social structures that persisted across generations. These weren't solitary monsters wandering empty landscapes. They were members of functioning communities that had been perfecting their strategies for tens of millions of years. The secret to their success lay partly in their construction. Late Jurassic sauropods had evolved skeletal systems so sophisticated they make modern engineering look crude. Their vertebrae were hollow, riddled with air sacs that reduced weight while maintaining strength. Their necks were held up, not by massive muscles, but by elaborate systems of tendons and ligaments that worked like biological suspension bridges. But the real innovation was in their digestive systems. These animals were living fermentation plants. Their enormous guts housed communities of bacteria that could break down the toughest plant fibres. They didn't need to chew, they just swallowed and let chemistry do the work. This allowed them to extract energy from vegetation that other herbivores couldn't even digest. Conifer needles, tough cycad fronds, the fibrous stems of fern, all became fuel for bodies that needed to consume hundreds of kilograms of plant matter every single day. And the forests of the late Jurassic could support that appetite. This was still a greenhouse world, with atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that turned even marginal habitats into productive ecosystems. Plants grew year-round. Trees reached heights that wouldn't be seen again until flowering plants evolved. The very air was thick with moisture and nutrients, but while the sauropods were perfecting their gigantism, other dinosaurs were experimenting with different solutions to the challenges of Jurassic life. The stegosaurs had taken the approach of becoming living fortresses. Stegosaurus itself, wandering the Morrison Formation of western North America, carried an array of defensive equipment that seems almost theatrical in its elaboration. The famous backplates weren't just armour, they were complex thermoregulatory devices, billboards for species recognition, and possibly even weapons of intimidation. And that tail, armed with 4 massive spikes that paleontologists have seriously named the Thagomizer, could deliver killing blows to predators foolish enough to attack from behind. Evidence from punctured theropod bones suggests these weapons weren't just for show, but perhaps more remarkable than their armament was their social behaviour. Stegosaur trackways show multiple individuals moving together, with smaller animals protected in the centre of the group. These weren't just armoured herbivores, they were coordinated defenders with group tactics that maximised their survival in a world full of increasingly sophisticated predators. Because the predators were getting sophisticated indeed. Allosaurus had reached the pinnacle of its evolutionary refinement by the late Jurassic. This wasn't the clumsy movie monster of popular imagination. This was a precision hunting instrument. 12 metres of coordinated muscle and bone designed around a single function, killing things larger than itself. Its skull was built like a hatchet, designed to deliver devastating, slashing attacks rather than crushing bites. Its arms were powerful enough to grapple with struggling prey. Its legs could sustain pursuit over long distances, and its brain was proportionally larger than those of earlier predators, suggesting enhanced coordination and possibly even problem-solving abilities. But Allosaurus wasn't hunting alone. Evidence from multiple sites suggests these predators may have engaged in coordinated group attacks, something unprecedented in the fossil record up to that point. Not pack hunting in the mammalian sense, but opportunistic cooperation that allowed them to tackle prey that would have been impossible for individual hunters. The implications of this are staggering. Coordinated hunting requires communication, planning, and social awareness. It suggests that by the late Jurassic, some dinosaur predators had developed cognitive abilities that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of social mammals, and they needed every advantage they could get, because the herbivores weren't standing still, evolutionarily speaking. The late Jurassic saw the emergence of the first heavily armoured dinosaurs that would eventually evolve into the ankylosaurs. Gargoyleosaurus, found in the Morrison Formation, was already experimenting with the defensive strategies that would make its descendants nearly invulnerable to attack. These early armoured dinosaurs represented a completely different approach to the predator-prey arms race. Instead of getting bigger or faster, they were getting harder to kill. Their skin was reinforced with bony plates. Their skulls were thickened into battering rams. Some even had armoured eyelids. But the most remarkable innovation was behavioural. Evidence suggests these armoured dinosaurs could lock their limbs and anchor themselves to the ground, turning their bodies into immovable objects that predators couldn't flip or manipulate. They were living bunkers designed to wait out attacks rather than flee from them. This diversity of defensive strategies, gigantism, armour, weaponry, speed, group coordination, speaks to the incredible predation pressure that characterised late Jurassic ecosystems. This wasn't a peaceful world where herbivores grazed unmolested. This was an arms race that had been escalating for tens of millions of years, producing increasingly sophisticated adaptations on both sides. And it was about to produce something entirely new. In the understory of those late Jurassic forests, small theropod dinosaurs were experimenting with adaptations that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Some had developed feathers, not for flight, but for insulation and display. Others were developing increasingly bird-like skeletal features, though they were still firmly terrestrial. Archaeopteryx represents the most famous of these experiments, a creature caught perfectly between dinosaur and bird, with teeth and claws and a long bony tail, but also with genuine flight feathers and the ability to glide between trees. But Archaeopteryx wasn't alone. The late Jurassic forests were full of small dinosaurs, testing different approaches to aerial locomotion. Some were developing gliding membranes, others were experimenting with different feather arrangements. A few were evolving the skeletal modifications that would eventually allow powered flight. These experiments were taking place in the shadow of the giants, literally and figuratively. While massive sauropods dominated the canopy and large predators controlled the forest floor, small dinosaurs were exploring ecological niches that had never been available to vertebrates before. They were preparing for a world that didn't exist yet, a world where the giants would no longer dominate, where flexibility and innovation would matter more than raw size, where the ability to fly would provide access to resources that ground-bound creatures couldn't reach. But that world was still in the future. For now, in the late Jurassic, the giants still ruled. The ecosystems they had created were still stable, still productive, still capable of supporting biological experiments on a scale that boggles the modern mind. Yet even as these ecosystems reached their peak complexity, the forces that would transform them were already in motion. Continental drift was accelerating, ocean chemistry was changing. New types of plants were beginning to spread through disturbed habitats. The late Jurassic giants were living in the most successful ecosystems in Earth's history. They were also living in ecosystems that were already becoming obsolete, though they had no way of knowing it. Their success would become their limitation. Their specialization would become their vulnerability. Their dominance would become their downfall, not through any fault of their own, but simply because the world was changing faster than they could adapt to it. But for now, in this moment, 150 million years ago, they were magnificent. They were successful. They were the undisputed rulers of a planet that seemed designed specifically to support them. They were the last giants of the Jurassic world, and they were about to teach the rest of life an important lesson about the difference between success and survival. The question isn't how the Jurassic ended. The question is whether anyone alive at the time would have noticed it ending at all, because there was no asteroid, no volcanic apocalypse, no sudden silence where there had been thunderous footsteps. The boundary between the Jurassic and what came next was drawn not in fire or flood, but in the quiet accumulation of changes so gradual that they barely registered above the background noise of ordinary life and death. If you were a diplodocus living through this transition, your world would have looked essentially identical to the world your great-great-grandmother had known. The same towering conifers, the same fern-choked understories, the same warm, humid air that never carried the threat of frost. Your daily routine of eating, walking, and avoiding predators would have remained unchanged. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The first clues weren't dramatic. In the shallow seas that periodically flooded the continental margins, microscopic organisms called coccolithophores began to multiply in unprecedented numbers. These tiny algae had existed for millions of years, but something in the changing ocean chemistry suddenly favoured their growth. Their calcium carbonate shells started accumulating on seafloors in quantities that would eventually build entire mountain ranges. The white cliffs of Dover, the limestone foundations of future cities, the chalky soils that would support different types of agriculture, all constructed, grain by grain, from the remains of organisms so small you'd need a microscope to see them individually. On land, changes were equally subtle, but perhaps more revolutionary. Scattered through the understories of established conifer forests, small weedy plants were conducting experiments that would reshape the planet. These weren't the flowering plants you might recognise today. They looked more like unremarkable shrubs, easily overlooked among the towering gymnosperms that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for over 100 million years. But they had something their competitors lacked: reproductive speed. While conifers took decades to mature and reproduce, these early angiosperms could complete their entire life cycle in a single growing season. They could colonize disturbed ground quickly, evolve rapidly in response to changing conditions, and spread to new habitats faster than established plant communities could exclude them. This gave them a crucial advantage in a world where the old certainties were beginning to crack. And crack they were, literally, as the supercontinent that had defined global geography for over 100 million years finally began to break apart in earnest. Pangaea had been showing stress fractures for tens of millions of years, but now the process was accelerating. The Atlantic Ocean was widening from a narrow rift into a genuine seaway. South America was beginning its slow dance away from Africa. India was starting its epic journey northward toward a collision with Asia that wouldn't occur for another 100 million years. These continental movements weren't just reshuffling geography. They were creating new mountain ranges, new ocean currents, new climate patterns. Regional weather systems that had remained stable throughout the Jurassic began to shift. Monsoon patterns changed direction. Temperature gradients between equator and poles became more pronounced. For ecosystems that had evolved under conditions of extraordinary stability, these changes created stress. Not the immediate catastrophic stress that shows up as mass extinctions in the fossil record, but chronic, persistent pressure that gradually favoured different survival strategies, different body plans, different ways of making a living. The giants that had dominated Jurassic landscapes weren't immediately threatened. Many sauropod lineages continued to thrive, and some would persist well into the Cretaceous. But their era of unchallenged dominance was quietly ending. Smaller herbivores were becoming more diverse and abundant. Ornithopods, the group that would eventually produce the duck-billed hadrosaurs, were developing more sophisticated teeth for processing tough plant material. Some were experimenting with elaborate crests and complex social behaviours that suggest increasingly intricate herd dynamics. The predators were evolving too. The large, generalised hunters of the Jurassic were giving way to more specialised forms. Some theropods were developing longer legs and lighter builds for sustained pursuit hunting. Others were evolving more powerful jaws and reinforced skulls for tackling heavily armoured prey. A few lineages were experimenting with the body plans that would eventually produce the tyrannosaurs. But perhaps the most significant changes were happening in groups that had been marginal throughout the Jurassic. Small theropod dinosaurs were becoming increasingly bird-like, not just in their feathered exteriors, but in their internal anatomy. Wing bones were becoming more sophisticated, breast muscles were enlarging, brain regions devoted to balance and spatial orientation were expanding. These weren't just dinosaurs with feathers anymore. They were dinosaurs learning to fly. Early mammals were diversifying beyond the tiny, generalised forms that had characterised the group for over 100 million years. Some were experimenting with aquatic lifestyles. Others were developing gliding membranes for moving between trees. A few were even testing out the burrowing adaptations that would serve their descendants well during future environmental crises. In the oceans, similar patterns were emerging. Marine reptile faunas that had remained relatively stable for tens of millions of years were beginning to turn over. Some ichthyosaur lineages went extinct, while others continued to thrive. Plesiosaurs were experimenting with new body plans, some becoming more whale-like, others pushing neck length to even greater extremes. New types of marine organisms were appearing too. Rudest bivalves, clam-like creatures that built reef structures, began to compete with traditional corals in shallow tropical seas. These weren't necessarily superior to the organisms they replaced, but they were better adapted to the shifting chemical conditions of transitional ocean systems. Even the ammonites, those incredibly successful spiral-shelled cephalopods that had served as living timepieces throughout the Mesozoic, were showing signs of evolutionary stress. Their shell shapes became more varied and experimental. Some developed elaborate ornamental features that seem almost desperate in their complexity. This kind of morphological experimentation often signals populations under pressure, trying new strategies as old ones become less reliable. The ammonites were still successful. They would continue to diversify throughout the early Cretaceous, but they were no longer the stable, predictable presence they had been for so long. The transition wasn't uniform across the planet. Different regions experienced different rates and types of change. Some areas maintained relatively stable Jurassic-type ecosystems well into the Cretaceous. Others were transformed more rapidly as new species colonized and established themselves in disturbed habitats. This patchwork pattern of change is typical of gradual evolutionary transitions. Unlike mass extinctions, which affect the entire planet simultaneously, periods of evolutionary turnover often proceed at different rates in different places, creating complex mosaics of old and new forms coexisting across the landscape. But the overall trend was unmistakable. The biological world that emerged from this transition was fundamentally different from what had come before, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of countless small changes accumulating over millions of years. The sauropods were still there, but they were no longer the unquestioned dominants of terrestrial ecosystems. Flowering plants were still rare, but they were spreading rapidly through any habitat that offered them a foothold. Birds were still primitive, but they were beginning to explore ecological roles that had never existed before. Most importantly, the pace of evolutionary change itself had accelerated. The rock-solid stability that had characterized much of the Jurassic was giving way to something more dynamic, more unpredictable. Ecosystems that had persisted largely unchanged for tens of millions of years were being reshaped within just a few million years. This acceleration would characterize the rest of the Mesozoic era and beyond. The Cretaceous would witness evolutionary innovations at a pace not seen since the Cambrian explosion. Flowering plants would transform terrestrial ecosystems completely. New types of marine organisms would reshape oceanic food webs from the bottom up. Dinosaurs would diversify into forms more varied and spectacular than anything the Jurassic had produced. But all of this future complexity was built on foundations laid during the Jurassic transition. The experimental body plans, the adaptive strategies, the ecological relationships that would dominate the Cretaceous were already being tested in small populations, marginal habitats, and evolutionary lineages that seemed insignificant compared to the giants that still ruled the visible landscape. The end of the Jurassic wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning, the start of a new phase in the history of life on Earth. A phase characterized not by the stable dominance of a few highly successful groups, but by rapid change, constant innovation, and evolutionary experimentation on a scale the planet had never seen before. The age of giants was giving way to an age of diversity. The age of stability was becoming an age of adaptation. And life, as it always does, was rising to meet the challenge with creativity that would have been impossible under the stable conditions that had made the Jurassic giants possible in the first place. Looking back from our perspective 145 million years later, we can see this transition clearly in the fossil record. We can trace the lineages that went extinct, track the ones that survived, and follow the new groups that emerged to fill vacant ecological roles. We can measure the isotope ratios that tell us about changing atmospheric conditions. We can map the geographic distributions that reveal shifting continental positions. But for the organisms living through this transition, the changes would have been almost imperceptible. A slightly different mix of plant species in the forest understory. New types of predators appearing occasionally in the distance, familiar species becoming less common, while unfamiliar ones became more abundant. The Jurassic giants didn't know they were becoming historical footnotes. The early flowering plants didn't know they were inheriting the Earth. The small theropods developing sophisticated flight adaptations didn't know they were becoming birds. They were simply living, reproducing, adapting to whatever conditions they encountered. The grand patterns, the evolutionary trends, the transformation of entire ecosystems, these emerge only when we step back and look at millions of years of accumulated change through the lens of deep time. And that perhaps is the most remarkable thing about the end of the Jurassic. It demonstrates that the most profound transformations in the history of life don't always require catastrophes. Sometimes they require only time and the relentless creativity of evolution working through countless generations of organisms, simply trying to survive and reproduce in a slowly changing world. The Jurassic had been Earth's experiment in pushing biological systems to their absolute limits. It had succeeded spectacularly, producing ecosystems of unprecedented complexity and organisms of unmatched size. But success, in evolutionary terms, is always temporary. The stable greenhouse conditions that had made Jurassic gigantism possible were giving way to more variable patterns that favoured flexibility over size, adaptation over specialisation, innovation over persistence. The world the giants had created was already becoming the world that would replace them. The age of giants was ending not with collapse but with transformation, and from that transformation would emerge the most diverse, most dynamic, most rapidly evolving biological communities in Earth's history. The Jurassic period had asked the question, how big can life become? The Cretaceous period would ask something entirely different. How creative can life become? And the answer to that question would reshape the planet in ways that are still unfolding today. In the flowers that bloom outside your window, and the birds that sing in them, in the mammals that inherited the ecological roles once filled by dinosaurs, and in the endless creativity of life finding new ways to fill every available niche in an ever-changing world. The giants taught us that life can achieve sizes that seem to violate the laws of physics, but their successors would teach us something even more remarkable, that life can achieve diversity that seems to violate the laws of imagination. That story, though, belongs to another time, another period, another experiment in what's possible when evolution has the freedom to dream without limits. For now, we can only stand in awe of what the Jurassic accomplished. For nearly 60 million years, it sustained ecosystems of a complexity and productivity that we can barely comprehend. It produced organisms whose size and sophistication still seem impossible. It demonstrated that life, given enough time and the right conditions, can achieve things that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about what's biologically possible. The Jurassic was Earth's age of giants, and while that age is long past, its lessons continue to resonate through every subsequent chapter in the history of life on our planet. But there's something we haven't talked about yet, something that was happening in the shadows while those giants thundered across the landscape. Something so quiet, so easily overlooked, that most people never realise it was the real revolution taking place during the Jurassic. While dinosaurs were busy becoming enormous, life was also becoming small, incredibly, impossibly small, and in that smallness lay innovations that would outlast every giant that ever walked the earth. Picture this. You're standing in a Jurassic forest, surrounded by towering conifers and the distant rumble of sauropod herds. You look down at your feet, and there, scurrying through the leaf litter, is something no bigger than your thumb. Brown fur, bright eyes, a twitching nose, constantly testing the air for danger. This is Jurassic, one of the earliest known placental mammals. And while it might look like nothing more than a furry scrap of evolutionary leftover, it's actually conducting one of the most important experiments in the history of vertebrate life. It's learning how to be warm, not warm-blooded in the simple sense, where many dinosaurs had already achieved some form of metabolic heat regulation, but warm in a way that's more sophisticated, more flexible, more energy-intensive than anything that had come before. This tiny mammal could maintain its body temperature regardless of external conditions. It could remain active during cool nights when dinosaurs became sluggish. It could survive in environments where reptilian metabolisms simply couldn't function efficiently. But that metabolic flexibility came at a cost. Jurassic needed to eat constantly. Its high-powered metabolism burned through calories at a rate that would have been unsustainable for larger animals. It lived life in fast forward, with a heart rate that would seem frantic to modern standards. And it wasn't alone. The Jurassic understory was full of small mammals experimenting with different approaches to high-energy living. Some were becoming specialized for different diets. Others were testing out new reproductive strategies. A few were even experimenting with flight. Yes, flight. Not the powered flight that birds were developing, but gliding flight that allowed them to move through the forest canopy without touching the ground. Vellaticitherium was one of these aerial pioneers. About the size of a modern flying squirrel, it had developed skin membranes that stretched between its elongated fingers and limbs. These weren't the sophisticated wings of bats. Those wouldn't evolve for another 100 million years, but they were functional gliding surfaces that allowed Vellaticitherium to launch itself from tree to tree, staying safely above the dangerous forest floor. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these early mammals wasn't their individual adaptations. It was their diversity. While popular imagination tends to picture Mesozoic mammals as generic shrew-like creatures, the reality was far more varied. Some were aquatic specialists, like Castoricorda, which had developed webbed feet and a flattened tail for swimming. Its teeth were designed for catching fish and other aquatic prey. It lived in and around the rivers and lakes that crisscrossed Jurassic landscapes, occupying ecological niches that wouldn't be available to mammals again until after the dinosaurs were gone. Others were becoming specialized diggers. Fruitafossil had powerful forelimbs and reinforced claws that suggest it spent much of its time underground, possibly feeding on insects and other invertebrates that lived in the soil. Its skeleton shows adaptations that wouldn't look out of place on a modern mole, and some were getting bigger. Not giant by dinosaur standards, but large enough to challenge the assumption that all Mesozoic mammals were tiny. Reponomamus, though it lived slightly later in the Cretaceous, shows us where mammalian evolution was heading. This badger-sized predator was large enough to hunt small dinosaurs. We've found dinosaur remains in its stomach contents. But size wasn't the only direction mammalian evolution was exploring. Intelligence was becoming increasingly important as well. Mammalian brains were getting larger relative to body size, developing more complex sensory processing abilities and more sophisticated behavioural repertoires. This neurological investment made sense for creatures living in a world dominated by giant predators. A small mammal couldn't outrun an Allosaurus or outfight a Stegosaurus, but it could potentially outthink them, or at least react faster to threats and opportunities. The fossil record suggests that Jurassic mammals were developing enhanced senses of hearing, smell, and touch. Their inner ears were becoming more sophisticated, allowing for better balance and spatial orientation. Their snouts were elongating to accommodate larger olfactory processing centres. Some may have even been developing primitive forms of echolocation, using sound to navigate in dark environments where vision was limited. While we can't prove this directly from fossils, the anatomical features that support echolocation in modern mammals were beginning to appear in their Jurassic ancestors. But perhaps the most important mammalian innovation was happening at the cellular level. These creatures were perfecting a form of reproduction that would eventually prove superior to anything dinosaurs ever developed. Live birth combined with extended parental care gave mammalian offspring advantages that egg-laying reptiles couldn't match. Mammalian mothers could carry their developing young through dangerous periods, providing them with nutrition and protection that external eggs couldn't offer. After birth, mammalian parents continued to invest heavily in their offspring. Milk production allowed for extended nursing periods that gave young mammals time to develop the complex behaviours and neural pathways that their sophisticated lifestyles required. This reproductive strategy was energy intensive and limited the number of offspring that could be produced at one time, but it dramatically increased the survival rate of individual young, which proved to be a successful, long-term strategy in unpredictable environments. The social behaviours that developed around this extended parental care were becoming increasingly complex as well. Some mammalian species may have been developing rudimentary forms of cooperative breeding, where multiple adults helped care for young that weren't necessarily their own offspring. While we can't observe these behaviours directly in fossil mammals, the anatomical features that support complex social behaviours in modern mammals were beginning to evolve during this period. Brain regions associated with social cognition were expanding. Scent-marking glands were developing. Vocal communication systems were becoming more sophisticated. All of these innovations were happening in creatures that most contemporary observers would have dismissed as insignificant. The mammals of the Jurassic were easy to overlook, easy to ignore, easy to assume were evolutionary dead ends waiting for their betters to inherit the Earth. But they weren't waiting. They were preparing. Every metabolic innovation, every sensory enhancement, every behavioural adaptation was building toward a future that couldn't be seen from the perspective of the Jurassic present. A future where flexibility would matter more than size, where intelligence would triumph over brute force, where the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions would prove more valuable than perfect adaptation to stable ones. The mammals weren't just surviving in the shadows of the giants. They were learning skills that the giants couldn't afford to develop. They were becoming generalists in a world of specialists, developing the kind of evolutionary flexibility that would prove essential when the stable Jurassic world finally came to an end, and their influence was already beginning to be felt in subtle ways. Mammalian predation pressure was driving the evolution of smaller dinosaur species toward different defensive strategies. Mammalian competition for resources was forcing other small vertebrates to specialize more narrowly or find new ecological niches. The ecosystems of the late Jurassic weren't just dominated by giants. They were shaped by the complex interactions between giants and the small creatures that lived alongside them. And increasingly, those small creatures were mammals whose descendants would someday inherit the roles the giants thought were theirs forever. But inheritance was still millions of years in the future. For now, the mammals remained small, hidden, overlooked by most of the larger creatures that shared their world. They were conducting their experiments in metabolism, behaviour, and reproduction without fanfare, without recognition, without any indication that they were preparing for greatness. They were simply living, adapting, surviving in whatever ways worked best for their particular circumstances. The fact that those adaptations would eventually prove superior to gigantism was invisible from the perspective of creatures struggling to avoid being stepped on by the very dinosaurs they would someday replace. The Jurassic mammals teach us something profound about evolution and survival. Success isn't always visible. Innovation doesn't always announce itself with thunderous footsteps or towering necks. Sometimes the most important developments in the history of life happen quietly, in small creatures that most observers never notice. The giants captured attention because they were impossible to ignore, but the small mammals captured the future because they were impossible to stop. Their size wasn't a limitation, it was a strategy. Their obscurity wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. They were learning to be something that had never existed before. Warm-blooded, intelligent, socially complex vertebrates capable of thriving in almost any environment the planet could create. And they were learning these lessons while sharing the world with creatures so large and successful that extinction seemed impossible. The irony is perfect. While the giants were perfecting strategies that worked brilliantly in stable Jurassic conditions, the mammals were developing strategies that would work brilliantly in unstable conditions. Neither group knew that the stability was temporary, that change was coming, that the future would belong not to the most perfectly adapted, but to the most adaptable. The Jurassic was teaching two different lessons about survival simultaneously. On the surface, it was demonstrating that life could achieve sizes and complexities that seemed to push the boundaries of physical possibility. But underneath, it was also demonstrating that life could achieve flexibilities and capabilities that would prove even more valuable in the long run. Both lessons were true, both were important, but only one would prove to be permanent. The giants would have their day, would dominate their world completely, would achieve a kind of biological perfection that still seems impossible today. But the mammals would have tomorrow, and tomorrow would last far longer than anyone living in the Jurassic could have imagined. In the end, the most important story of the Jurassic might not be about the creatures that ruled it, but about the creatures that learned from it. The ones that took the lessons of gigantism and applied them in miniature, developing intensities of living that matched the giants' intensities of being. They were small, but they were mighty in ways that mattered more than size, and their mightiness would reshape the world long after the last giant footprint had been covered by sediment and time. Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. If you're here in the quiet hours, looking for something to fill the space between wakefulness and sleep, you've found the right place. Tonight we're continuing our journey through the Jurassic period, and we're about to witness something that might be even more remarkable than the giants we've already met. Because while those massive sauropods were reshaping continents with their footsteps, something else was happening in the warm Jurassic seas. Something that would redefine what it meant to be a predator in the water. The oceans of 150 million years ago weren't just home to oversized fish and spiral-shelled ammonites. They were ruled by creatures so perfectly adapted to aquatic life that they make modern whales look like evolutionary newcomers. These were the marine reptiles of the Jurassic, and they had turned the art of underwater hunting into something approaching perfection. Picture Ophthalmosaurus cruising through the warm Tethys Sea. At first glance, you might mistake it for a dolphin. The same streamlined body, the same efficient swimming motion, the same obvious intelligence behind its movements. But look closer, and you'll see something that seems almost impossible. Its eyes were the size of dinner plates. These weren't just big eyes for show, they were precision optical instruments, capable of gathering light with an efficiency that approaches the theoretical limits of what biology can achieve. In the perpetual twilight of the deep ocean, where even the faintest bioluminescent flash could reveal prey or predator, these enormous eyes gave Ophthalmosaurus advantages that no modern marine predator possesses. And they needed those advantages because these creatures were diving deeper than any air-breathing animal had ever gone before. Bone density studies suggest some ichthyosaurs could reach depths of 500 meters or more, holding their breath for periods that would challenge even the most accomplished modern diving mammals. But they weren't just deep divers, they were speed demons. Biomechanical analysis suggests the largest ichthyosaurs could reach speeds of 40 kilometers per hour, fast enough to generate cavitation bubbles around their fins, fast enough to create sonic booms in the water when they turned sharply. They had evolved something that wouldn't be seen again until the age of whales, the perfect fusion of size, speed, and intelligence in a marine environment. But the ichthyosaurs weren't the only marine giants of the Jurassic. Swimming alongside them were creatures even stranger, the plesiosaurs, with their impossibly long necks and paddle-shaped limbs. These animals represent one of evolution's most audacious experiments in vertebrate body design. Cryptoclydus had a neck containing over 70 vertebrae, more than twice as many as a giraffe. But unlike a giraffe's neck, which fights gravity every moment of every day, plesiosaur necks were neutrally buoyant in water. This allowed them to reach lengths that would be structurally impossible on land. The longest plesiosaur necks stretched over 7 meters. Imagine a telephone pole with the flexibility of a snake, capable of striking in any direction within a sphere larger than most modern swimming pools. They used these necks as precision hunting weapons. While their massive bodies remained perfectly motionless in the water column, their heads could dart out to snatch fish, squid, and smaller marine reptiles with lightning precision. They were living submarine periscopes, equipped with jaws full of needle-sharp teeth and the patience to wait hours for the perfect strike. But perhaps most remarkable was their sophistication. These weren't primitive reptiles that happened to be large. They were highly evolved predators with complex behaviours that suggest intelligence levels approaching those of modern marine mammals. Some ichthyosaurs show evidence of deep-diving adaptations that wouldn't be matched until the evolution of sperm whales. Their rib cages were reinforced to resist crushing pressure. Their blood chemistry was modified to store unprecedented amounts of oxygen. Some may have even developed primitive forms of echolocation for hunting in the absolute darkness of the deep ocean. The plesiosaurs developed their own remarkable innovations. Evidence suggests some species could maintain their body temperature well above that of the surrounding water, even in the cold depths where they hunted. This metabolic feat would have given them crucial advantages over their cold-blooded prey, and both groups achieved something that still seems impossible. They dominated marine ecosystems for over 150 million years. Their fossils appear in oceanic deposits from the Arctic to the tropics, testimony to a global success that dwarfs the current age of whales. Their success was built on the same foundation that supported the terrestrial giants, the incredible biological productivity of Jurassic oceans. The warm, shallow seas that covered much of the continental margins were perfect breeding grounds for marine life. Plankton bloomed in quantities that modern oceans can barely support. Fish diversified into thousands of species. The entire oceanic food web was supercharged with energy. But the marine giants weren't just beneficiaries of this productivity, they were active architects of it. Their predation pressure drove the evolution of faster, smarter prey species. Their migrations helped distribute nutrients across entire ocean basins. Their massive biomass represented a significant component of global carbon cycling. Some marine reptiles were developing social behaviours that rivaled those of modern dolphins and whales. Fossil evidence suggests certain species lived and hunted in coordinated groups, using pack tactics to overwhelm prey that individual hunters couldn't handle alone. This social complexity implies neurological sophistication that we're only beginning to appreciate. Brains capable of processing social information, making group decisions, perhaps even developing something approaching culture. We'll never know exactly how intelligent these creatures were. Soft tissues like brains don't fossilize well, and behaviour leaves only indirect traces in stone. But the evidence we do have suggests cognitive abilities that wouldn't be seen again in marine environments until the rise of modern cetaceans. They were the true monsters of the Jurassic seas, not because they were terrible or destructive, but because they represented biological perfection in an aquatic environment that most terrestrial creatures couldn't even survive in. But like their terrestrial counterparts, These marine giants were living in borrowed time. The stable conditions that had allowed them to reach such extraordinary sizes and sophistication were beginning to change. Ocean chemistry was shifting. Sea levels were fluctuating. New types of prey organisms were evolving that required different hunting strategies. The transition wouldn't be immediate or catastrophic. Many marine reptile lineages would continue to thrive well into the Cretaceous, and some would reach even larger sizes than their Jurassic ancestors. But the golden age of marine reptile dominance was slowly drawing to a close. In its place would emerge marine ecosystems dominated by different groups, with different strategies for survival. The age of marine reptile giants would eventually give way to the age of modern marine life, but that transformation was still millions of years in the future. For now, in the late Jurassic, the oceans belonged to creatures that still seem mythical to modern eyes. Animals so perfectly adapted to their aquatic environment that they make our current marine life seem almost primitive by comparison. They were conducting evolutionary experiments in intelligence, social behaviour, and sensory capability that pushed the boundaries of what vertebrate life could achieve in water. And they were doing it with body plans and adaptive strategies that have never been repeated, innovations that disappeared forever when their lineages finally went extinct. The Jurassic oceans were Earth's laboratory for testing the limits of aquatic vertebrate life. The results of those experiments still echo through our modern seas, in the whales and dolphins that inherited ecological roles once filled by ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. But something was lost when the marine reptiles finally disappeared. Body plans and capabilities that represented unique solutions to the challenges of life in water. Solutions that worked brilliantly for over 150 million years, only to vanish when the rules of the game changed once again. They were some of evolution's greatest successes, and like all great successes in the history of life, they were also unrepeatable moments that can never come again. The marine giants of the Jurassic were the last of their kind, and they didn't know it. They were perfecting strategies for living in a stable oceanic world, unaware that stability itself was becoming a thing of the past. But their legacy lives on in every modern marine ecosystem, in the complex food webs they helped establish, in the evolutionary pressures they created, and in the constant reminder that the oceans have always been capable of supporting life forms that challenge our understanding of what's biologically possible. The Jurassic seas were never empty. They were full of wonders that we're still trying to understand, populated by creatures whose like will never be seen again. And in the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of the Jurassic marine giants, that the history of life is not just a story of what survived, but also a story of what was possible, however briefly, in the deep currents of time. When the stars finally aligned for the end of this extraordinary chapter, they did so without fanfare, without catastrophe, without even a moment that anyone alive at the time would have recognised as significant. The Jurassic period didn't end with an asteroid impact or volcanic apocalypse. It ended the way most things in deep time actually end, gradually, quietly, through the accumulation of changes so subtle they barely registered above the background noise of ordinary existence. If you were standing in those final Jurassic forests 145 million years ago, watching the last of the true giants move through landscapes they had shaped for nearly 60 million years, you wouldn't have seen an ending. You would have seen continuity, the same towering conifers reaching toward warm skies, the same fern-covered understories where small mammals scurried between roots, the same rhythmic thunder of massive footsteps that had defined terrestrial life for longer than most species could remember. But beneath that surface continuity, everything was changing. In the shallow seas that periodically flooded continental margins, microscopic organisms were conducting a quiet revolution. Coccolithophores, tiny algae with calcium carbonate shells, were multiplying in unprecedented numbers. Their individual shells were invisible to the naked eye, but collectively they were building something enormous. The limestone foundations of future mountain ranges, the chalky soils that would support entirely different types of ecosystems, the raw materials for landscapes that wouldn't exist for millions of years. On land, scattered through the understories of established gymnosperm forests, small flowering plants were testing reproductive strategies that would reshape the planet. These weren't the colourful blooms we associate with modern flowers. They were modest, weedy things that looked almost indistinguishable from their non-flowering relatives. But they had something their competitors lacked: speed. While conifers and cycads took decades to mature and reproduce, these early angiosperms could complete their entire life cycle in a single growing season. They colonised disturbed ground quickly, evolved rapidly in response to changing conditions, and spread to new habitats faster than established plant communities could exclude them. This gave them a crucial advantage in a world where the old certainties were beginning to fracture. And fracture they were, quite literally, as the supercontinent that had defined global geography for over 100 million years finally began breaking apart in earnest. The process had been underway for tens of millions of years, but now it was accelerating. The Atlantic Ocean was widening from a narrow rift into a genuine seaway. Continental masses were drifting apart at rates that would reshape global climate patterns within just a few million years. These movements weren't just rearranging geography. They were creating new mountain ranges that altered wind patterns, new ocean currents that redistributed heat around the globe, new seasonal rhythms that challenged ecosystems adapted to the rock-solid stability of the Jurassic greenhouse. The giants that had thrived under those stable conditions weren't immediately threatened. Many sauropod lineages would continue to prosper well into the Cretaceous. Some would even reach larger sizes than their Jurassic ancestors. But their era of unchallenged dominance was quietly ending. Smaller dinosaurs were becoming more diverse and abundant. Ornithopods were developing increasingly sophisticated teeth for processing tough vegetation. Some were experimenting with elaborate social behaviours that suggest complex herd dynamics. A few were even beginning to develop the jaw mechanisms that would eventually allow their descendants to chew their food rather than simply swallow it whole. The predators were evolving too. The generalised hunters of the Jurassic were giving way to specialists. Some theropods were developing longer legs and lighter builds for sustained pursuit hunting. Others were evolving more powerful jaws for tackling increasingly well-armoured prey. A few lineages were experimenting with body plans that would eventually produce the most famous predators in Earth's history. But perhaps the most significant changes were happening in groups that had been marginal throughout the Jurassic. Small theropod dinosaurs were becoming increasingly bird-like, not just in their external appearance, but in their internal anatomy. Flight-related skeletal modifications were becoming more sophisticated. Brain regions devoted to balance and spatial orientation were expanding. These weren't just feathered dinosaurs anymore. They were dinosaurs learning to master powered flight. Early mammals were diversifying beyond the tiny, generalized forms that had characterized the group for over 100 million years. Some were testing aquatic lifestyles. Others were developing gliding adaptations for moving through forest canopies. A few were experimenting with the burrowing specializations that would serve their descendants well during future environmental upheavals. In the oceans, similar patterns of change were emerging. Marine reptile communities that had remained stable for tens of millions of years were beginning to turn over. Some ichthyosaur lineages disappeared, while others continued to thrive. Plesiosaurs were experimenting with new body plans that pushed the boundaries of what vertebrate anatomy could achieve in water. New types of marine organisms were appearing too. Rudest bivalves began competing with traditional corals in shallow tropical seas. These clam-like creatures built reef structures that were better adapted to the shifting chemical conditions of transitional ocean systems. Even the ammonites, those incredibly successful cephalopods that had served as living timepieces throughout the Mesozoic, were showing signs of evolutionary stress. Their shell shapes became more varied and experimental. Some developed ornamental features of almost baroque complexity, suggesting populations under pressure to try new survival strategies. The transition wasn't uniform across the planet. Different regions experienced different rates and types of change. Some areas maintained relatively stable Jurassic-type ecosystems well into the Cretaceous. Others were transformed rapidly as new species colonized and established themselves in disturbed habitats. This patchwork pattern is typical of gradual evolutionary transitions. Unlike mass extinctions, which affect the entire planet simultaneously, periods of evolutionary turnover often proceed at different rates in different places, creating complex mosaics of old and new forms coexisting across the landscape. But the overall trend was unmistakable. The biological world emerging from this transition was fundamentally different from what had come before, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of countless small changes accumulating over millions of years. The pace of evolutionary change itself was accelerating. The stability that had characterized much of the Jurassic was giving way to something more dynamic, more unpredictable. Ecosystems that had persisted largely unchanged for tens of millions of years were being reshaped within just a few million years. This acceleration would define the rest of the Mesozoic era. The Cretaceous would witness evolutionary innovations at a pace not seen since the Cambrian explosion. Flowering plants would transform terrestrial ecosystems completely. New types of marine organisms would reshape oceanic food webs from the bottom up. Dinosaurs would diversify into forms more varied and spectacular than anything the Jurassic had produced. But all of this future complexity was built on foundations laid during the Jurassic transition. The experimental body plans, the adaptive strategies, the ecological relationships that would dominate the Cretaceous were already being tested in small populations and marginal habitats. The end of the Jurassic wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning, the start of a new phase in the history of life on Earth. A phase characterized not by the stable dominance of a few highly successful groups, but by rapid change, constant innovation, and evolutionary experimentation on an unprecedented scale. Looking back from our perspective 145 million years later, we can see this transition clearly in the fossil record. We can trace the lineages that went extinct, track the ones that survived, and follow the new groups that emerged to fill vacant ecological roles. But for the organisms living through this transition, the changes would have been almost imperceptible. A slightly different mix of plant species in the forest, new types of predators appearing occasionally, familiar species becoming less common, while unfamiliar ones became more abundant. The Jurassic giants didn't know they were becoming historical footnotes. The early flowering plants didn't know they were inheriting the Earth. The small theropods perfecting flight didn't know they were becoming birds. They were simply living, adapting to whatever conditions they encountered. The grand patterns emerge only when we step back and look at millions of years of accumulated change through the lens of deep time. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about the end of the Jurassic. It demonstrates that the most profound transformations in the history of life don't always require catastrophes. Sometimes they require only time, and the relentless creativity of evolution working through countless generations of organisms trying to survive in a slowly changing world. The Jurassic had been Earth's experiment in pushing biological systems to their absolute limits. It succeeded spectacularly, producing ecosystems of unprecedented complexity and organisms of unmatched size. But success, in evolutionary terms, is always temporary. The stable greenhouse conditions that made Jurassic gigantism possible were giving way to more variable patterns that favoured flexibility over size, adaptation over specialisation, innovation over persistence. The world the giants had created was already becoming the world that would replace them. The age of giants was ending, not with collapse, but with transformation. And from that transformation would emerge the most diverse, most dynamic, most rapidly evolving biological communities in Earth's history. The Jurassic period had asked, how big can life become? The answer filled the fossil record with creatures that still seem impossible today, but the period that followed would ask something entirely different. How creative can life become? That creativity would reshape the planet in ways that are still unfolding. In the flowers blooming outside your window, in the birds singing in them, in the mammals that inherited ecological roles once filled by dinosaurs, and in the endless ingenuity of life finding new ways to fill every available niche in an ever-changing world. The giants taught us that life can achieve sizes that seem to violate physics. Their successors would teach us something even more remarkable, that life can achieve diversity that seems to violate imagination. For nearly 60 million years, the Jurassic sustained ecosystems of complexity and productivity that we can barely comprehend. It produced organisms whose size and sophistication still challenge our understanding of what's biologically possible. It demonstrated that life, given enough time and the right conditions, can achieve things that push the boundaries of the conceivable. The Jurassic was Earth's age of giants, and while that age is long past, its lessons continue to resonate through every chapter in the history of life on our planet. So the next time you see a bird in flight, remember that it carries the genes of dinosaurs who once thundered across Jurassic landscapes. When you smell a flower, remember that it descends from weedy plants that learn to bloom in the shadows of giants. When you watch a whale surface in distant seas, remember that it inherited oceans once ruled by reptilian leviathans whose like will never be seen again. The age of giants is over, but the age of wonders continues, built on foundations laid when the earth was young and hot, and full of creatures too magnificent to believe, except that we have their bones to prove they were real. And in the end, perhaps that's enough. To know that once, just once in the history of our planet, life grew so large and lived so fully that even extinction couldn't diminish the wonder of what they achieved. The Jurassic giants are gone. But the Earth still remembers them in every fossil, every rock layer, every mountain built from ancient seafloors. And we remember them too, in our capacity for awe at what life can accomplish when it dares to dream without limits. Thank you for joining us tonight, bored people. If this helped you understand something about our planet's deep past, if it gave you a moment of quiet wonder in a noisy world, or if it simply helped you drift off to sleep with visions of giants in your head, then it served its purpose. The story of the Jurassic doesn't really end, of course. It transforms. Like every chapter in Earth's long book, it flows into what comes next without clear borders or dramatic punctuation marks. The giants fade slowly into the Cretaceous, making room for flowers and birds and mammals that learned patience in the shadows. But here's what strikes me most about this period. It wasn't just about getting big, it was about getting balanced. For 60 million years, life found a way to sustain complexity on a scale we can barely imagine. Ecosystems that supported creatures weighing 50 tons while also nurturing mammals the size of mice. Oceans that fed filter-feeding fish larger than buses while maintaining populations of tiny ammonites whose shells we still find scattered like ancient confetti in limestone quarries. That balance required something we've largely lost in our modern world: deep time thinking. The ability to operate on scales measured not in quarters or election cycles, but in millions of years. The Jurassic giants succeeded because their world had patience. It gave evolution room to experiment, to fail, to try again, to slowly perfect solutions to problems we're only now beginning to understand. Their world was hot, yes, much hotter than ours, but it was also stable in ways that allowed life to mature, to develop relationships between species that lasted longer than entire mountain ranges. The sauropods didn't just get big overnight, they spent tens of millions of years learning how to be giants without falling over. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that bigger is always better, but that given enough time and the right conditions, life can achieve things that seem to break the rules of possibility. The Jurassic proved that Earth can support biological experiments on scales that dwarf anything we see today. And perhaps that should give us hope, because if life could survive the end Triassic extinction and emerge into something as magnificent as the Age of Giants, then maybe our current planetary crisis isn't the end of the story either. Maybe it's just another transition, another moment when life pauses, adapts, and finds new ways to flourish. The giants are gone, but the creativity that made them possible is still here, still working, still dreaming in DNA and deep time. So whether you're drifting off to sleep now or staying awake to wonder, remember this: you're part of the same experiment that produced Diplodocus and Allosaurus and all those impossible marine reptiles. You're made of the same elements that once walked on legs like tree trunks and swam with eyes the size of dinner plates. The age of giants is over, but the age of wonders never ends. Sleep well, bored people. The earth is still spinning, still experimenting, still becoming something new, and tomorrow there will be more stories waiting to be told.